Welcome to the 5th of December and the next window for the TooFatLardies Advent Calendar for 2024. And behind the window for the 5th of December, we have the following question. When do you think you'll run out of hobby storage space? And what happens then? Some of the Advent windows over the years have been exciting. Some have been warm and cosy. But I think this one's downright terrifying in a way. I'm sure that it's something all of us have thought about and wrestled with. What does happen when you feel you're running out of space? Whether it's a cupboard, a room, a garage, a shed, or even an annex of a house, who knows? Most people run out of hobby space at some point. And I would imagine when that point starts to appear, it stimulates a discussion about where we want our hobby to go and what we need to be able to enjoy our hobby to the fullest. There's an easy solution, of course, to storage, which is get more storage. We could buy another cupboard or buy a shed or rent some storage space or move house. But those solutions, while they obviously do solve the immediate issue of storage space, it's kind of not always the only solution, or perhaps not even the best solution. I mean, how many sheds can you have in your garden? That's a question that you should address to Richard the next time you see him. I think one of the obvious alternatives to just buying more storage is looking at what we've got, selling or repurposing some of the figures we've already created or the terrain that we've built. That's radical in some ways because you're dealing with a problem by removing the items. Now, I'm sure we all know people who paint like demons and they sell on a lot of stuff, and the stuff they sell is wonderful and people want to buy it. And that's certainly viable. But for people who perhaps are slower painters, who've accumulated a collection over the years and they're not really familiar with selling that collection, just repurposing and moving it on to somebody else can be a bit of a traumatic situation and can be difficult. That being said, after the pandemic, I cleared out a lot of the stuff I had, the periods I had figures and terrain for that I was never going to play again or was never going to paint in the first place. And all the board game collection, apart from just one or two, I passed on to good homes. So selling things is certainly a viable solution, if a little bit radical. One of the things that I've also tried to do is not to buy things for retail therapy, to really think about what I was buying. And focusing on what I would describe as being legitimate projects, and really only one or two projects at that. Again, that's good advice perhaps, but not necessarily for everyone. So I can hear one of you thinking, well, what is the solution, Sidney? I'm not sure I've got a great solution, but I do have some ideas which hopefully might help. Certainly downsizing a scale, both as regards the miniatures and terrain and the size of the table, I think is a really interesting, viable way of dealing with storage problems. So 2mm or 6mm games use a fraction of the table size, which might be required to otherwise recreate Gaugamela or Marathon or perhaps Cannae or whatever battle from world history that one's trying to recreate. It's a very viable way to recreate some of the iconic battles of world history, but without the footprint of trying to do that in 15mm or even 28mm gaming. One has literally shrunken the amount of storage space that's needed for the table and also for the terrain. One of the big things about storage space being used up is 28mm terrain. That's big and bulky. You can really fit all the terrain you'd ever need, I think, for a 2mm or maybe even a 6mm game into really quite a small box. But it's not just shrinking the figure size and the terrain size physically, which I think would help with storage solutions. It's shrinking the size of the table which is being used. And over the last few years, as people who listen to the Oddcast and maybe these Advent windows will know, I've really enjoyed experimenting with a much smaller table or board space, something which is no bigger than 2 feet square and actually has been really 18 inches square for the Japanese and Musketeer games that I've been playing up and down the UK at different shows and gaming days. And that's been a conscious choice. I wanted to reduce the footprint of the games I was playing. A footprint as regards time, a footprint as regards the amount of energy needed to paint and the figures and build the relevant terrain, but also the footprint of the game. I wanted to have, if you like, a more intimate space around the table where people could sit on four sides of the table, but weren't shouting at each other or across a crowded room. It was a table which was small. A small dining table is more than adequate. And those were important design characteristics which I thought about when I was confronted with having built so much big and bulky terrain over the last 15 or 20 years. I really wanted to have a game which didn't involve as much stuff, because I was partly conscious about the storage that I would need if I kept on the journey that I was on before the pandemic. And in that regard, dealing with a storage solution and downsizing games, I think, is a viable way forward which has a mirror in other parts of life. For example, we sometimes talk of people downsizing, moving to a smaller house with less renovation work needed or fewer bedrooms. And frequently, that type of career or life downsizing doesn't just involve a reorganisation of physical space. It's also a mental response, a moment in which people view their life or their career through a different lens. And in some ways, dealing with the wargaming storage issues might prompt a consideration of whether that's a good time to reframe the games that we play and pursue, potentially, a different style or physical footprint of gaming. And with that comes other challenges. You swap a physical space challenge, but you get a different challenge in game design. So smaller tables or boards mean potentially focusing on rule mechanisms like time or ground scale or movement more, because there's just less space around the table in which figures can move, particularly when you've shrunk the size of the game but not the scale of the figures. There's more intimacy in those games, not just in the physical space around the table, but also a consequential series of questions about the proximity of figures against other figures on a smaller table, and also where all the ancillary gaming items around the board or around the table space can be located. But those challenges, I think, are interesting, and they can be evolved in a way that physical space considerations can't always be addressed. At least, that is, until your smaller footprint games multiply in numbers. So for me, part of the challenge of solving the wargames storage problem is really focusing on what we want, in the essence, from our miniature figure wargames. And also, how many times do we want to replay those games? But the games that we really want to keep and we'll play again and again, we'll always find storage space for. And for the other projects, which may not be as large as those iconic centrepiece games that we like to play, for those other projects, then maybe some sort of mechanism under which those are downsized is viable. And, well, I suppose as a last resort, there's probably room in Richard's garden for yet another shed in which I can pass over one or two of the Dux Britannium armies that I've painted. I'm guessing those Saxons are still in good condition, Richard?